He is on the Mount Rushmore of sports wagering. It is the great Todd Fuhrman. You see him everywhere, from Fox Bet Live to CBS Sports HQ to his infamous podcast to Twitter, where he has over 100,000 followers, and he's on Fox Sports Radio. You see him on so many different platforms. I don't know how I got a couple minutes of Todd's time. I'm Bryan Fenley, an anchor at Fox Sports Radio. Todd, it is an honor, and I would really like to use this opportunity to learn more about your backstory and some of the places in which you haven't talked a whole lot about. And that's maybe before you became this infamous, this demigod in the world of sports gambling. And how early did you know in your life that you had more brain cells than the average person?
Well, after that introduction, the only place I can go is down as this interview continues. So you put me on such a pedestal. Hopefully I don't chop my own legs out before we're done kind of deep diving a little bit of what's taken me to the place I'm at now and some of the opportunities that have befell me along the way. But trying to figure out a foundation, I mean, I was in sports as young as 3. And one of the most vivid memories I have of playing youth soccer, something you couldn't get away with now, is coming home crying after the first day I'd gone to practice. And my parents asking me, what the hell are you crying about? Our soccer coach then threatened to cut our hands off if we touched the ball at any point during practice. So you want to put the fear of God into 3 and 4-year-olds? Tell them you're going to use a chainsaw and cut their hands off as soccer players who had never done anything with their feet in the past. And that kind of established a foundation for a sport that I would play all the way up through secondary school and through as a senior in college, ultimately lending itself to other sports. But as far as wagering, I mean, my dad is well-versed in the trades as far as a commodities broker. So there was a little bit of gambling DNA that was in my bloodstream right from day one. And he was a big-time sports fan, still is to this very day, probably bets a lot more games than even I do because he's the definition of an action junkie. And so he would get me involved, whether they were small office pools. I never quite knew the stakes. And my mom told me not to ask when I was young, until ultimately I was the one, kind of the Pied Piper, leading him, trying to teach him some tools of the trade and bestow upon him some of the knowledge that I've picked up by interactions with some of the sharpest people in the sports gambling space, over the last 20 to 25 years.
Where did the DNA in terms of your photogenic memory come from?
I wish I really had an understanding of where that kind of was. I think for sports, some of the facts, figures, team names, and everything else just kind of stuck. If you asked me to remember what I had for dinner last week, I would fail miserably. If you asked me to tell you when my friends' birthdays or family anniversaries or anything along those lines, the way I kind of look at it, and it sounds terrible to say, if something has the potential to make me money on down the road, there's a much better chance that I'm ultimately going to remember it. And for me, it was kind of the numbers, the facts and figures that stuck, player history. And the reality of it is, it's kind of embarrassing. When I was 19 or 20, a lot more information really stuck than it does now. But I think ultimately your hard drive can only take on so much information. And when you go through various purge stages, as we all know, you remember some of those things when you were 12 or 13, but you might not necessarily remember the SIU Edwardsville, Tennessee Tech game that you watched 2.5 weeks ago, the same way with vivid clarity.
What are some of the most unique places where your mind all of a sudden just becomes engulfed with numbers, facts, and figures? Like maybe you're at somebody's wedding or you're driving somewhere. Like where do you see your brain and its mental capacities around sports and math and numbers and odds come in really odd places?
Well, a full disclosure, I probably set odds on things that I'd be better served not to, and or learn to keep your mouth shut, which I've ultimately figured out over the years, something that I'm much more in tune with at 38 going on 39 than I would have been at 21 or 22 when you're setting odds at your friends' weddings about, I don't really think this is going to have the staying power. And you want to set the over under a duration of how long it's going to last, how many years before the first child, and then trying to stack the deck in your favor for a 50-50 proposition for boys versus girls when your friends want to try and get involved. But I kind of look at it, and I think it's just the way that you go about it. Everyone sees life through a different prism. And whether it's a scientist or a botanist looking at a flower and plant and that thing really sparking their interest, for me, it's always been about numbers. And it's as simple as straightforward as when you're a freshman going through fraternity hazing. Hey, how many beers is this guy going to polish off before he busts his chin on the ground to trying to set numbers on a NESCAC football game so you could bet $5 or $10 with a buddy and have a little rooting interest when Wesleyan was going to lose a game by 5+ touchdowns, but you at least had a back door to try and sweat through. So for me, numbers have always been a big part. And that's just kind of how I've approached things. You know, I have a nerdy knack for wanting to build spreadsheets and figure things out. Stuff as simple and straightforward as your caloric intake and some of your, mile times that you do that translates itself, thankfully, to a lot of sports betting. But one thing, to be quite honest, and if you've read any Malcolm Gladwell, as I'm sure a lot of our listeners have, it's that thin slicing idea, something that you can't always quite put your finger on. And whether you're looking at a betting market for college basketball or the NHL, where you know the teams inside and out, or European soccer, where you may never have heard of a third division team in the Turkish league, you look at it and go, something doesn't feel right there. This is a game I have to try and attack and ultimately find an angle to be able to support your initial hypothesis and be willing and able to also understand that you can go in with preconceived notions. You may discover a nugget and go, I couldn't have been further from the truth. But as any sports bettor knows, there is no more humbling experience than think you figured out the secret sauce and you go through a day of watching college football from start to finish. You ultimately go 1-7 in all your bets. And whether you lose a game by a hook or you lose by 35, it does make you often question the meaning of life.
Oh, wow. Yeah, that's wow. That's powerful, hard-hitting stuff there. The great Todd Fuhrman is with us. His podcast, Bet the Board podcast. Go download it. Go subscribe on Twitter at Todd Fuhrman. But it's not spelled like the hat behind him. No, there's an H in there right before the R. But if you go Todd Fuhrman on Twitter.
You mean this Fuhrman Paladin's hat has kind of been through the war. I'm not sure if I could pull off purple corduroy at any time. But if someone out there does want to happen to make a purple corduroy jacket, I'd be more than happy to wear it, because purple is the color of royalty. And when I can ultimately put the crown on my head on Fox Bet Live, there's no better way than to make a signature statement.
Well, no question about it. And you have to be on that show and have some fun with Clay Travis and inject some humility into that man.
It's impossible. Let me tell you, Brad.
Speaking of humility, I heard the story about how you had your aunt and uncle on a safari in Africa, and they met the CEO of Caesar's Palace, and how that led to a connection with you going there. But it eventually kind of getting your start in gambling there, and then that led to media, that led to sports. But on a humble perspective, what are some of the most humbling acts or duties you tried to put yourself through just to get in front of the right people, just to break through when you weren't where you were anywhere near where you were today, but you had this thirst, this hunger to succeed, and you were ready to do anything to make it?
Well, I think this may come off as elitist on some level, but it paints a perspective in terms of where I started to ultimately where I had. My parents have always been the biggest supporters of any ridiculous pursuit that I've ever had, whether it was thinking, at 5'10", 135 pounds, or probably much more slender weights along the way, that I could have aspirations of playing, Division I college hockey. Those were quickly dashed. Let's put that out there first and foremost. But knowing that I hadn't been tested, or at least I didn't think I had from an academic perspective, going to a public high school all the way through, came from a middle-class background where, we didn't have a ton of means at our disposal. And when the opportunity came up to try and interview and explore some of what secondary education was like on the East Coast, I went through the whole prep school circuit, went to some of the more prominent schools. And for those folks familiar with the world, the Exeters, the Deerfields, the Choates, and was kind of blown away, because when you grow up middle class in a Jewish family and you get exposed to that world, it can be eye-opening and create some culture shock, and wasn't quite sure what I was getting myself into. Lo and behold, you talk about humbling. I think I applied to 12 or 13 of the most high-profile schools, was waitlisted, once or twice, and flat out rejected, because it's extremely rare for someone to come in as a junior who doesn't want to go back and repeat his sophomore year to be part of that environment, especially as an athlete and someone who wanted to be a hockey player and contribute. Well, as fate might have it, there was a smaller school from an athletic standpoint called the Groton School that just happened to have a goalie at the time that was having a little bit of academic trouble. And one of the prep school coaches that I spoke to said, hey, my close friend is a head coach there. They're looking for a goalie. And from an academic standpoint, you may ultimately fit the profile for what they're looking to try and bring in. So as an afterthought, it was probably 11 o'clock at night, and my application had to be postmarked the next day. I went, you know what, I don't think it's going to happen, but I'll fill it all out. Well, as luck may have it, the first school I looked at was actually Lawrence Academy in a small town called Groton, Massachusetts. a school a stone's throw away was where I would end up as the last school I applied to. And I'll forever be thankful to this day that there are folks with a lot deeper pockets than I had then, that were able to contribute money to the financial aid package. And I came in there as a student on a full ride, not knowing what I was getting myself into from an academic standpoint, had really been thrown into the deep end, was one of the only new male student accepted as a member of the junior class. So you're walking into an environment where all the cliques had been determined. The hockey players were unhappy that one of their buddies had been let go because his academics weren't up to snuff. And I had to work tooth and nail, not only to try and overcome some of the social barriers that were there, but realizing, my family didn't have a ski house or a ski chalet in Vail or Aspen. We didn't have a house in the Hamptons, and you have to try and find ways to relate. So thankfully, sports always became the common denominator. And this kid from the perceived other side of the tracks that could hold his own, talking about the Knicks and being a Yankees fan, ultimately got me on the same playing field as those kids. And I never worked harder, honestly, Bryan, in 2 years academically than I did at Groton. And it was humbling and embarrassing. I mean, I would turn in papers and my teacher would look at me and go, this isn't work anywhere close to what we've expected. And I would go over to my English professor's house, before I turned in every single paper and had to go through outlines. I had to turn in 3 or 4 drafts. And it was the first time in my life where I picked up D's on papers. And I think it's a lot of what kids go through. When you can coast through a high school, you get to college and realize, wait, there are kids that are as smart as me. They're more talented and they can get by with even less work. So just putting in that work ethic, sleeping 3 to 4 hours a night, trying to work from an athletic and academic standpoint. So the 2 years I spent at Groton, I was extremely fortunate to be in that environment, but they taught me more about what I could do as an individual than anything else I've ever accomplished. And to be quite honest, it made 4 years at Wesleyan almost a walk in the park. The only equalizer there is every college kid goes through. You have to learn how to handle things with a hangover. And when you're sober, only about 65 to 70% of the time.
Plus, straight A students are not always the most successful. It's those that, they get by. And it's fascinating that despite some of the early struggles that you had, that you've become such a prominent player in sports gambling. When you think about like a Mount Rushmore of the most preeminent voices in your line of work, where do you categorize yourself? Where do you rate yourself in relation to the others?
Oh, I'm nowhere close right now. I mean, I'm just still scratching the surface of what I'm ultimately going to be able to do in this space. And I'm forever thankful and grateful for the opportunities. I mean, you mentioned Clay, and a funny anecdote there that I'm not sure if you've heard, but I know a lot of people have. Social media is such a powerful tool. And while we see it now causing more ills in society than it probably should, if it wasn't for one fateful direct message that I sent to Clay, I'm not quite sure my career ever would have blown up the way it has. I was traveling internationally. I had picked up his book, Dixieland Delight, shot him a note and said, hey, I really enjoyed your book. Listened to your radio show, this, that, and the other. Well, Clay got back to me pretty quickly and saw what I did for a living. I was an odds maker at Caesars at that time. He said, I'm coming out to Vegas. I'd love to sit down and chat with you. And you talk about humility. Clay shows up to the sports book at Caesars with an autographed copy of his book. And that was kind of what he gave me initially. And I'm going, this guy, I really got to deal with this. Him and his colleagues at the time invited me on a radio show in Nashville as kind of a one-off to see what I could do. Bryan, I've been on that show every Wednesday for 10 plus years since I started in the industry. They've changed hosts and I'm now the longest running guest they've had on there. But why that was so important is that Clay helped introduce me to some of the Fox executives with the launch of FS1. And they said, we want to try and find a way to include gambling into our Fox Sports Live programming. Came out there, screen tested, ironically enough, with Joel Klatt, who's turned into a superstar in his own world as far as college football and what he's going to accomplish. And had no idea, had no formal media training, had done a handful of radio spots. And you know what? This is a shot in the dark. Let's see what happens. Well, ultimately, I got the position. They flew me out to LA every single Friday night to come on there. And I was like a middle reliever. I'd come on there as a specialist. The show would be an hour long. I'd get maybe 90 seconds to 2 minutes with Clay and Andy Roddick or Carissa, who filled in, to talk about gambling. And the running joke was sometimes they had to wake me up in the green room because I wasn't ready for when they were ultimately going to bring me out there. I didn't have the cachet of Mariano Rivera where I got my walk-up music or anything else. And that kind of opened some doors. And the folks for Fox were great. I mean, guys like Scott Ackerson, who's no longer there, John Entz, and Jacob Ullman took me under their wing. They taught me a ton about the business and ultimately even tried to pitch them on NASCAR. They were joking. I think we were sitting in the Wynn Sports book for the NASCAR awards. I go, does anybody bet on this? So it's funny you mention it. rattled off everything that was going on. And that's another show. I think I've been on Race Hub for 5 or 6 years, talking about NASCAR, specifically in the betting realm, and trying to make it more accessible for the casual fan who never believed the betting market like that existed. So it's always one of those things. And not to sit here on a soapbox or anything else, but tell people, you have to take shots. You have to be willing to put yourself out there and fail. And if people don't return emails, they don't return direct messages, they don't return phone calls, persistence is going to pay off, and you never know where it's going to happen. Whether it's you want to be a librarian, you want to be a scientist, you want to be a doctor, or you want to be a truck driver. I mean, you have to continue to push, because the worst thing that someone can tell you is no or ignore you. And if that's what's going to dissuade you from following a potential passion, well, then to be quite honest, this may be harsh, then you don't deserve to try and reap the rewards or benefits.
That's so well said. Todd Fuhrman with us. I'm Bryan Fenley, an anchor at Fox Sports Radio. And it's fun because sometimes I get to fill in as the update anchor for Clay Travis. So that happens from time to time when getting to speak with him. But yeah, nothing is going to fall in your lap, especially something that you want. And you're a testament to what it takes to put yourself out there. I've heard so much about your man cave and how you've dolled it up, you've beautified it somewhat. Give us a picture, an image of what we're looking at here, because Todd Fuhrman, multiple games going on. How does he digest it all?
Well, it's taken a little while to get there. I don't want people to think that I rolled out of Wesleyan as an undergrad with a degree in international econ and was able to devise, my ultimate man cave. It started out with 3 tube TVs on 3 misshapen side tables that I had to pick up at flea markets, with a cable splitter that probably created a fire hazard and more electrical headaches for my roommates at the time, going, what the hell is this? There may or may not have been a night or two where somebody stumbled over one of those cables after too many adult beverages on the strip, and a tube TV could have had a spider web that we had to watch the NFL on Sunday with. But over the last 6 to 9 months, and COVID slowed it down a little bit like it did for everyone else in the world, I had one of my friends who's big into AV and tech help me set up what he thought was the ultimate way to try and maximize things. So now we have a setup that I think is consistent with one of the best that's out there to take advantage of the space. We have 5 TVs. We got a 65-inch in the middle. We got full surround sound. We got 443s, surrounding it, and we can kind of jockey back and forth. The biggest thing that I'm working on is a universal remote, because it's a lot to try and handle 8 or 9 TV remotes. But I will say, again, the nerd in me, on a college football Saturday, NFL Sunday, I actually mark down the game times and the TV channels that all these events are on. Because let's not kid ourselves, it's damn near impossible to figure out where this Conference USA football game is going to be, where this English Premier League soccer match is going to be. And I wish all this stuff could be under one roof instead of 37 streaming services, 900 cable channels, and everything else. But it can be a little bit of sensory overload. We're still working on trying to explain to the girlfriend that I can watch 4 sporting events on the peripheral TVs, and we can watch a show together in the middle. But I won't lie, it's a little bit distracting if you're not quite used to it.
That's fantastic. Todd, my last question for you is the fun, it's discussed many times, the chemistry that people say you have on Fox Bet Live. You hear that all the time with yourself and Cousin Sal and Clay Travis and Rachel Bonetta. What's a funny instance in between segments off air that Clay said that was really funny, that got you just blowing up in laughter, that you recall? Something that was off the cuff and where you guys were kind of digging at each other in a playful way?
Oh, I mean, what you see on air is what you see kind of behind the scenes. Obviously, it's a little bit more G-rated to a certain extent than some of the language that'll get used. But you talk about chemistry, and I really don't believe that can be faked. You see it all the time on some of these shows where personalities will go their separate directions. And I think the perfect illustration was the Super Bowl week, where we had the opportunity to be down in Miami on that beautiful set for all the studio shows. And the running joke was, how many other shows do we believe where the lead talent is actually eating lunch with each other, eating dinner with one another, inviting significant others, wives, and all of that to join? And we probably had dinner, at least in some capacity, 2, 3, or 4 of us when our schedules aligned, 6 of the 7 nights that we were down there, because we genuinely enjoy one another's company. And it's great to hear you say that, because hopefully that chemistry carries through on air, that while there is ball busting, it does create that family atmosphere. And when it comes to things that, people like Cousin Sal, Clay, or Rachel will say, I mean, they're some of the sharpest and most creative people, that it's all authentic. I mean, there's nothing that's really scripted or rehearsed. You have to be quick. You have to think on your feet. And a lot of people go, oh, well, you guys pre-tape the show. No, we don't. What you see is what you get. There's about a 6-second delay. And oftentimes there's a little bit of filter. I think the best commentary, if we could ever find a way, is when the producers get in our ear and it's a comment normally from cousin Sal or Clay more so than Rachel or myself. And they go, nope, no, don't say that. Moving on. We have to get through this, whether it's a political reference or anything else under the sun. I think having a hidden camera in that control room would be great to try and see the expressions on their faces, not knowing what's going to come out of anybody's mouth next. And it's one of those things that's been a real joy to be a part of. And I have to imagine when the Fox team, led by Charlie Dixon, started this show 3 years ago, and we had all never met. Obviously, Clay and I had worked together, but we didn't know cousin Sal. Rachel didn't know the gambling space at all. And we sat down to do our first table read. If you'd be talking 2.5 years later that the gambling space had taken off and we'd really create that true family atmosphere and chemistry, I think anybody at Fox would have been lying, including the four of us, just to have this opportunity to continue to grow the brand, despite the show name change after 2 years.
You spoke about hidden camera. I would love to see a camera while you are watching multiple games going on and your girlfriend's watching the television show that's next to you and see how you are trying to converse. I promise you, this is my final question. A funny prank done on Clay Travis that you were behind, that you recall, something that happened?
You know what? I can't take credit for this one, to be honest, but I give Rachel and cousin Sal a ton of credit. When they had a guy on Radio Row fake a heart attack for
right.
Clay, that they got up at the crack of dawn to try and do that. And they didn't involve me in it. I don't know if they were afraid I was going to leak it or anything else. But that's just the comedic genius of those two. I mean, I know what my lane is. It's sports more than anything else. And I can think on my feet. But if you're going to have me come up with hidden camera bits or think anything along those lines, I mean, I'm clearly out of my wheelhouse to try and set that up. But for those folks that haven't seen some of the video footage, I think it's out there, whether it's YouTube or somewhere else. I'd encourage them to go check it out. You had a fictitious equipment manager come on the air and fake a heart attack real time where Clay and Rachel got him. And at 6 o'clock in the morning, Pacific time or whatever it was, for them to all be in cahoots with one another, orchestrate it, was definitely tremendous. I think we aired the clip, if memory serves me correct, on Lock It In at the time. And that was one of those things that'll stick with me forever. And no, there's no doubt we pulled pranks on each other. Not quite as often as we'd like, though, just because none of us are really in the same city. That cousin Sal and Rachel are working on the lot in LA, and Clay's out in Nashville. I'm in Vegas, and we haven't been able to interact or be together, honestly, for over a year now since Super Bowl when we were down in Miami together.
Todd Fuhrman, one of the best in the business, one of the most genuine guys in the business, one of the most hardworking people in the business, and one of the most smartest people in the biz. Thank you so much, Todd. I'm Bryan Fenley, an anchor at Fox Sports Radio. Really appreciate it, and I'm so happy for your success. No one deserves it more than you.
Hey, I appreciate the opportunity. And one last thing, kind of going back when you talk about, some of the people that have been role models and influences. I mean, I'd be remiss. I know I mentioned my parents. But kind of my two mentors in the space, guys that are out there now still working in sports gambling. A gentleman by the name of Chuck Esposito, who took me under his wing when I hadn't had any experience, and I asked a whole lot of dumb questions on Saturdays and Sundays in that Caesar Sportsbook, along with the likes of Mark Tatino, who does some risk management stuff, and two female mentors, and Cindy Gauntz and Kathy Bowman. I mean, that was kind of my sports betting family that gave me the foundation to allow me to accomplish all of this stuff, and will be forever grateful to those four individuals for anything I can accomplish going forward.
So nicely said, and I think thousands and thousands of people are forever grateful for your Bet the Board podcast as you give them some inside information. But I
feel, Bryan, I got to give Payne a shout out. I feel
yes.
like babysitting him becomes a full-time job. But no, for those folks that don't know Payne, I mean, he's one of the sharpest sports bettors out there, and he's forgotten more about the industry despite being younger than I'll ever learn. And you mentioned the podcast. I mean, that really becomes where we can do our deep dives. And if I had to do it with the podcast with anybody else, it wouldn't be half the product it's become, so much so that it's really taken off. And I have a lot of listeners, the Fox community, FanDuel, and a variety of other people to thank. But it's not Academy Awards, and I'd be up here forever if I tried to mention everyone that's played such a big role in that podcast. Just being another tool in the toolkit for us to try and hand out sports betting gospel as best we can.
Well, you'd said that when you started, you only had like a couple hundred listeners, and it sounded like you were talking through a tin can. And now you're describing it as like visiting Whole Foods. And I've heard you describe that, where it's very specialized, and you try to appease as many people as possible. You don't want to talk down to people like you're saying, but you also want to have tangible, smart information for more of the diehards out there as well. So it's you found your niche and it's exploding, and hopefully it isn't so bad as well. I don't mind going there as
No,
well.
and thankfully, honestly, the price on our podcast is significantly cheaper than what it costs to put together one of those pre-prepared meals at Whole Foods. So we like to be free and easy and still make you smarter and nourish the mind and body the same way for the sports betting enthusiast that's out there.
Todd Fuhrman, go download his podcast, Bet the Board. Follow him on Twitter at Todd Fuhrman, Fuhrman, not FURMAN, as the hat behind says. Also, Fox Bet Live, CBS Sports HQ, Fox Sports Radio. The list continues to go on. I'm Bryan Fenley. Todd, thanks again. This was a whole lot of fun. Look forward to seeing you down the road.